Hey everyone, it's me, Supersonic7C, and welcome to Syntax Error, the show where we analyze aspects of games and discuss how to design them. Recently, I've been thinking a lot about what truly makes difficulty in games engaging or interesting and not frustrating or boring. Like, if you had to boil it down to one thing, what is it that makes players enjoy a game's difficulty? Chances are, if you ask this question to most game designers, they'll tell you that balanced or fair difficulty is what makes players enjoy the challenge. Originally, I also thought that was the answer, and I still do think that makes sense on some level, but the more I think about it, the more it seems like a situational answer that only sometimes creates engaging difficulty. Like, sure, I think it's fair to say that most of the time this answer checks out because players usually want challenges that feel balanced. In fact, that's definitely what I usually want when I play games, but here's the thing. Have you ever played a segment of a game and stopped being engaged with the difficulty because you actively wished it was less balanced? I have, and I know that can sound really weird and like something that I would hate in reality if I actually got what I believe I wanted, but there have seriously been multiple times where I think unbalanced difficulty has made me enjoy games more than I would have if the difficulty was balanced. Of course, there's been way more times when unbalanced difficulty has killed my enjoyment of games, but those other experiences still exist. I also know I'm not the only person who experiences them. I mean, just look at all the people who love the genre of brutally difficult rage games, or love games that fulfill a power fantasy by having easy challenges. As far as I can tell, the fact those types of people exist disproves the idea that difficulty has to be balanced in order to be engaging. So, at least as of right now, I can only think of one answer to my question that actually makes sense and takes into account those types of player experiences. I think what truly creates engaging difficulty is player motivation, and I even think game designers can learn to cultivate player motivation and avoid detracting from it to increase their chances of creating engaging difficulty. So, what do I mean when I say player motivation, and how exactly does it create engaging difficulty? Well, first off, what I'm specifically referring to when I say player motivation is the player's level of desire to experience something within the game. This can be any aspect of the game, no matter how big or small, including things like the plot, environment, music, multiplayer, and, of course, difficulty or challenges. I like to think of it like this. When playing games, all players have multiple levels of motivation that relate to experiencing each and every aspect of the game. These motivation levels are naturally different for every player, and they fluctuate as players play the game based on anything that adds or detracts from player motivation. If a player is highly motivated to experience an aspect of a game, they'll stay engaged with it. But if anything drains their motivation, or if they were never motivated enough to begin with, they'll avoid that aspect instead. This applies to specific aspects of games, but also the entire game itself. All those multiple levels of motivation for each aspect add up to an overall level of motivation that determines if players want to continue playing the game or quit entirely. If a player's overall motivation drops below their unique threshold for their minimum level of motivation, then they're going to stop being engaged with the entire game itself. Or, in other words, game over. You probably know exactly what I mean if you've ever been playing a quest-based game where you're not motivated enough to even start any of the side quests, but you're so motivated to finish the main quest that you play the game whenever you can. Then you get to the point in the game where you're required to complete some of those side quests to continue with the main quest, and for some games, you're so motivated to complete the main quest that pushing on through those side quests is worth it. But in others, you're not motivated enough. So having to do those side quests makes your overall motivation drop below your threshold, and it just makes you quit the game. That's a perfect example of player motivation determining whether or not players are engaged with aspects of games or games in general. This also applies to the aspect of difficulty, and it's exactly why player motivation determines whether or not players are engaged with difficulty in games. Player motivation is what inspires players to attempt challenges regardless of their difficulty level. Challenges can be extremely easy, extremely hard, or anywhere in between, and all that matters is whether or not the player is motivated enough to engage with the difficulty. I know this may not sound true, but ask yourself, Have you ever enjoyed when a game has used extremely easy difficulty to give you a relaxing experience, but also hated when another game has given you a challenge that felt way too easy? Alternatively, how about this? Have you ever enjoyed when a game has used extremely hard difficulty to give you a brutally difficult challenge, but also hated when another game felt way too hard? Lastly, has there been a time when you've enjoyed how balanced a game's difficulty has felt, but also wished another game felt less balanced? I think it's safe to say that almost everyone's answer to all three of these questions, or at least one of these questions, would be a resounding, well, yeah, I guess I have. Regardless though, I've definitely had experiences like all three of these, and I think each one shows that, no matter the level of challenge, difficulty can't be engaging if players aren't motivated to engage with it in the first place. Now that we hopefully all agree that my player motivation theory makes at least some amount of sense, the question remains, how can we design our games in a way that motivates players to find the difficulty and challenges engaging? Well, it all comes down to what adds to and subtracts from player motivation. The more that challenges and games are designed using methods that increase player motivation, while avoiding methods that decrease player motivation, the more likely the player will be engaged with the difficulty. So, in that case, let's first talk about what improves player motivation. Anything that adds to player motivation can basically be described as aspects of games that create emotional investment in players. Personally, I think the most important of these aspects is one I've probably talked about enough already in different videos, so I'll keep it brief, but game feel heavily influences player motivation. After all, like I've literally said before, game feel is all about finding ways to make gameplay satisfying or engaging. So, of course, good game feel is incredible at increasing player motivation for any aspect it affects in a game, including challenges and difficulty. For example, I'm telling you right now, if the game Battletoads didn't feel incredible to play, there's no way in hell I would have ever stuck with it long enough to beat it, even with enabling the cheat code for infinite lives. It's one of the most brutally difficult, downright frustrating games I've ever played. Some levels literally feel impossible, and I say that as someone who's beaten every single one, even the infamous Turbo Tunnel, Rat Race, and Clinger Winger levels. The game has seriously earned its reputation as just downright too hard. That being said, I think it's literally the best feeling NES game I've ever played. Every punch in the game feels satisfying and impactful, and when you actually manage to do well in those infamous levels, it feels way better than it has any right to feel. If the game didn't have such good game feel, I definitely would have quickly given up on playing the game, and I never would have stayed engaged with any of its brutally difficult challenges. Other than game feel though, for a lot of players, the biggest aspect that emotionally invests them is often the game's plot or writing. Every time players advance through the game to save the life of a character, learn more about a world, or simply see how the story ends, that's the writing or plot motivating players. This can greatly drive players to face challenges, no matter how difficult, especially if some part of the plot or writing is encouraging them to do so. Rivals are a perfect example of games using their plot and written characters to motivate players and engage them with the game's difficulty. For me personally, the game Bayonetta has one of the best rival bosses I've ever fought. In the game, you're pitted up against massive, super cool and intimidating monstrosities and incredibly over-the-top boss fights. Yet, out of all of the bosses in the game, the one I was the most engaged with was Bayonetta's last fight with her human rival Jean. Throughout the game, Jean is set up as a rival from Bayonetta's past, who's written as a much more pompous and powerful witch than Bayonetta is. Jean is even repeatedly shown to have mastered the same magic powers as Bayonetta, some of which before Bayonetta had even begun to use them in the game. On top of this, the plot interrupts all fights between the two in one way or another until the player reaches Bayonetta and Jean's final fight. This intentionally gives players only partial victories and gets them even more invested in finally being able to surpass and defeat Jean. Additionally, for me personally at least, the game's writing in general influenced me to care about and identify with Bayonetta, which naturally made me more invested in defeating her rival. The plot and characters being written like this made me incredibly engaged with fighting John. In fact, I distinctly remember the last fight with John being the most difficult fight for me in the game, and I definitely lost countless times, but thanks to the game's writing and plot, I still loved that fight, and remember being more engaged with it than any other boss fight in the entire game, including the final boss. Another aspect that motivates players is the game's music. Seriously, music is so good at motivating players that sections of games backed with great music that complements the gameplay are often players' favorite sections in the entire game. It's not uncommon at all for players to even replay certain parts of games just because they like the music so much. This is especially common with music that complements the difficulty of the game, whether it be a relaxing acoustic tune for an easy challenge, or a hectic rock and roll theme for a difficult challenge. Hell, as odd as it may sound, sometimes if I'm losing motivation to continue playing a game, I'll intentionally mute the game's music while playing and listen to another song that emotionally invests me better than the original soundtrack. No joke, doing this led to a highlight of my entire Hat in Time playthrough. I kept losing an extremely difficult precision platforming challenge over and over, and was definitely not having fun. It didn't help at all that during every single attempt, I had to listen to music that just ended up making me feel anxious, rushed, and annoyed. Right before giving up, I decided to mute the in-game music and try one last time while listening to one of my favorite hype songs, Spy Break by Propellerheads, aka that song everybody knows from The Matrix. I cannot stress this enough. I literally went from being so low on motivation that I almost quit to being incredibly engaged with the platforming challenge. It took me a few more tries to beat the challenge, but by the time I did, not only did I feel like a super spy badass who knows kung fu, I actually had so much fun that I wanted to try the challenge again just for the hell of it. If I hadn't heard a song that hypes me up like this while playing the game, I would have never been anywhere near as engaged with the difficulty, and I'm sure I would have lost all motivation, given up on that challenge, and quit the game. Yet another aspect that adds to player motivation is the visual art or environment of games. This could get lumped in with the plot of games because of things like environmental or visual storytelling, but how games look can emotionally invest and motivate players on its own without any writing backing it up. Naturally, the more aspects of your game look visually interesting and the more visuals complement how the player feels when playing the game, the more players will be likely to stay engaged. For me, the rhythm game Thumper is a great example of a visually interesting game that actually uses its visuals to motivate players and complement its difficulty. It heavily focuses on visual art and leaves its plot entirely up to the player's imagination. Each level in the game has its own unique environment art that both keeps its visuals from getting boring and complements the game's difficulty. Some levels in the game are meant to relax players, so they have a calming or mesmerizing architecture, while other levels are difficult challenges with more hostile or intense environments. This alone made me find the difficulty to be much more engaging, but on top of that, the visuals are so unique and interesting to me that I didn't mind replaying levels whenever I died in the game, and I stayed motivated to retry the challenge in hopes of progressing to the next level and seeing its new visual art. If the visuals weren't so uniquely interesting, and if they didn't complement the difficulty like this, I'd be a lot more bored when playing the game, and much less willing to retry the levels. The next aspect that adds to player motivation is one that especially relates to players engaging with difficulty: competition in games. Anything that inspires players to compete against the game, their own records, and especially other players, is bound to both increase player motivation and increase engagement with the game's challenges. Even something as simple as adding a ranking system to your game that tracks the player's performance in certain challenges can greatly improve motivation and engagement with difficulty. This actually made me much more invested in getting high scores while playing Little Big Planet. I distinctly remember playing on my own and only caring slightly about my score in each level. I even remember that I used to avoid or rush through any level in the game specifically designed around score attack modes. Those levels were always more difficult than I wanted and just simply something I was less interested in than the other levels. Although, whenever I would play the game with my friends, I was far more motivated to try achieving the highest score in every level we played. I even actively wanted to replay the score attack levels over and over just to compete with my friends. Without that extra sense of competition from the game tracking all of our scores separately and pitting us against each other, I wouldn't have ever been invested in getting a high score or playing any of the score attack challenges. The last aspect that emotionally invests players and improves player motivation is a bit different than all the others, but nonetheless, wish fulfillment is a great way to engage players. This can be done in multiple ways, like simulating a certain thing that interests players, fulfilling players' power fantasies, or by simply letting players have a creative outlet. All that really matters is that players are given something they want. Naturally, if you design your game to do that, it's bound to motivate players and engage them with anything that helps fulfill their wish. For an example, well, you can honestly look at any game. Depending on how you look at it, every game can fulfill at least some players' wishes in one way or another. That being said, some games set out from the start of development to fulfill a certain desire of players. One of those games that is both well known for wish fulfillment and is actually a game that fulfilled one of my own wishes is the 2018 Spider-Man game. The game is so good at fulfilling players' Spider-Man related desires that it literally became a meme how often reviews of the game mention it making the player feel like Spider-Man. It's honestly such a well-known meme that I hesitated a lot to use it as an example in this video, but yeah. The game genuinely made me feel like Spider-Man, and for me personally, there's no better example of a game that's fulfilled my wishes. I've honestly been a huge Spider-Man fan my entire life, and this game fulfilled my longtime wish of feeling like Spider-Man better than any other game has fulfilled any of my wishes. It honestly fulfilled my wishes so much that it motivated me to beat every challenge and kept me engaged enough for me to 100% the game. Some of the game's challenges had me retrying them over and over just to get the best rank, and it was all because they were designed in a way that helped me fulfill my wish. In order to get the best rank, you really have to be resourceful at your combat abilities, dodge enemy attacks with quick reflexes, and move with as much agility and fluidity as possible. Naturally, this can be really difficult, but I stuck with it because, to me at least, it just made me feel more like Spider-Man, since I think of him as a resourceful character with quick reflexes and incredible agility. If the game wasn't designed in a way that fulfilled my wishes like this, I doubt I would have retried any of the challenges to get the best rank, and I know for a fact I wouldn't have been engaged enough with the difficulty to 100% the game. That about wraps up everything that adds to player motivation, so now let's talk about what detracts from player motivation. Naturally, a large chunk of what detracts from player motivation can basically be described as the opposite of everything we just talked about that adds to player motivation. I probably don't need to go into much detail about this considering, in a way, I just spent the last few minutes explaining why, but to give some quick examples, things like unsatisfying game feel, boring plot, annoying music, overused environments, and a lack of anything that inspires players to compete or fulfills their wishes are all things that reduce player motivation. There are other things that can cause players to lose motivation, though. By far, one of the most common things that decreases player motivation is just boredom itself. Anything that players are required to interact with that they don't find interesting will quickly eat away at their motivation. On top of that, stagnation can also lead to boredom as well. Even if players were initially interested in an aspect of a game and motivated to experience it, without some well-paced variety, most players will gradually become bored. Pacing variety like that can be very hard to nail down though, so a lot of games will make sure players always have the option to switch between different aspects of the game whenever they want, whether it be choosing between quests, swapping gameplay styles, playing minigames, or even changing the game's difficulty at will. Even just allowing challenges in games to be completed in multiple different ways can help stave off boredom. Variety is both the spice of life and the spice of not boring games. Moving on, other than boredom, another common detractor of player motivation is difficulty that doesn't match the player's desires. Similar to wish fulfillment, when players play through games, they want to experience a certain level or type of difficulty. This desire can change throughout playthroughs depending on multiple factors, including what the player is in the mood to deal with and what's happening in the game itself. Regardless though, when the player wants or expects a certain difficulty and they don't receive it, their motivation can drop. When players think the game's difficulty is far too easy, this can lead to them feeling unfulfilled. Granted, this outcome can be rare since players can easily rationalize a game being too easy by believing that their own sick gamer skills are just too good for the game. Although, in situations where the game is far easier than the player desires, they may lose a lot of satisfaction from completing the challenges. For example, I'm willing to bet most players can think of a time where they were super motivated to fight a really difficult final boss, and have everything they learned throughout playing the game be put to the test in a final challenge. But the finale of the game felt disappointing due to it being far too easy for the player. I'd talk about some examples, but instead, to avoid spoilers, here's a list of games with final bosses that I felt were disappointingly easy. Experiences like these rob players of a feeling of accomplishment and eat away at their motivation, especially if this occurs long before the game ends. Alternatively, when players think the game is too hard, their motivation can also plummet. This is usually because players find the game's difficulty to be unfair or overwhelming in one way or another when they don't want an experience like that currently. Each player naturally has a different idea of what makes difficulty overwhelming or unfair to them, but a good rule of thumb is that when players want fair and tolerable difficulty, anything that makes players feel like the game is cheating and difficult in a way that can't be solved by just getting reasonably better at the game can make players lose motivation. Players usually feel this way when gameplay is difficult for reasons they deem outside of their control, like glitchy challenges, obstacles made difficult by obstructed information, cheating players, or gameplay with harsh reaction time, memorization, and endurance requirements. For a downright perfect example, I need to bring back up A Hat in Time to talk about its appropriately named Death Wish challenges. I was excited for these challenges as someone who felt the base game was too easy, but they didn't match my desired difficulty at all. I personally find these challenges to be both incredibly overwhelming and very unfair, and I was definitely not in the mood for that when playing the game. Some death wishes are easier than others, but the one I had the most trouble with was the final challenge, Seal the Deal. I honestly found this challenge so soul-crushingly difficult that it genuinely felt impossible for human beings to have the reaction time and skills necessary to complete it without getting lucky. The challenge requires players to go through a boss rush of 4 extremely difficult bosses with limited health and checkpoints. Each of the bosses are incredibly difficult endurance challenges that attack players so frequently that the visuals alone can easily make obstacles near impossible to see, all while overwhelming players and potentially causing sensory overload. It doesn't help that those attacks are randomized and can sometimes combine in a way that can be nearly impossible to dodge or predict in any way. This makes learning to deal with each attack and memorizing the boss patterns difficult or sometimes impossible. The bosses even have a tendency to glitch out in multiple ways that can get you killed. None of this made the challenge feel like something I could just practice to achieve, and even when I did finally complete the Death Wish mode, after literally hundreds of deaths, I just felt like I wasted hours upon hours of my time. The difficulty feeling so unfair and overwhelming literally made me quit the game multiple times. If I was looking to play a rage game, that would have been totally fine, but by the time I learned it was so brutally difficult, the only reason I kept trying again was because A Hat in Time is one of my favorite games, which made me really want to 100% complete it. And, admittedly, I also wanted to make sure I fully experienced the Death Wish mode before talking about it in this very video, due to a disgusting mixture of spite, stubbornness, and shame. In the end, though, I didn't feel any sense of accomplishment and experienced more frustration than I think I've ever felt playing any other game, ever. Speaking of which, frustration in general is another huge detractor of player motivation. In a sense, what players find frustrating can be described as anything that doesn't fulfill the player's desires, but most players usually only get frustrated if it feels to them like the game is actively fighting against their desires. Technically, any detraction from player motivation can frustrate players, and the longer it persists, the more likely players will become frustrated. If a player wants a certain outcome or experience and the game is blocking that from them for any reason, that can easily frustrate players, especially if they're stressed in any way. This actually contributes to why difficulty in games has a high chance of frustrating players. Even if players are ultimately having fun, difficult challenges can naturally put stress on players, which can often lead to frustration, especially if they're losing the game. In fact, that brings us to our last detractor of player motivation: failing the game. While there are countless people who are really good at embracing failures and moving past them, pretty much no matter who you are, the more you fail, the more likely you'll be to give up. It sucks, but no matter what, even if losing the game is still fun, if players have any desire to win the game, each failure gradually chips away at player motivation to varying degrees depending on the player's ability to handle failing. There's not much you can really do to entirely avoid this, unless you just don't have a failure state in your game whatsoever, but you can help players cope with losing the game by avoiding punishing players too harshly for failing. Consequences for losing the game can definitely improve gameplay, but permanently punishing players in any way or erasing large amounts of progress to the point players feel like they're wasting time can be a surefire way to make anyone quit the game, unless that's the exact type of experience they're striving for. Almost all players know the painful experience of respawning at a checkpoint that was passed by eons ago, and now needing to replay parts of a game you've already surpassed just to get another chance at attempting the challenge that made you lose. Additionally, many players are all too familiar with failing a challenge that the game won't let you retry, and permanently having to deal with the consequences for the rest of the playthrough. Some players understandably want high-stakes challenges like those, but for players who don't, their motivation is guaranteed to tank. Before we wrap this video up, I want to discuss, or at least acknowledge, a couple more concepts that could relate to player motivation and difficulty. These concepts seem to me like they didn't quite fit into the earlier sections of this video, so I decided to just kinda mash them together at the end, like any definitely extremely good writer would definitely do. First off, what about external factors that affect player motivation? Things like players having pre-existing opinions of the game, the quality of the player's hardware, inaccurate perceptions of the game, or even whether or not the player is having a bad day can all affect the motivation of players. For example, I've had plenty of games hyped up to me to the point where they didn't live up to the opinions I heard about them. Additionally, there's been countless times where my motivation to play a game, especially games I find difficult, has been completely ruined because I was just having a bad day for completely unrelated reasons. None of these examples are the fault of the designers or their games, but they undoubtedly affect player motivation. So is there anything we as designers can do about these things? Honestly, not that I know of. While I do believe that there could be some things designers may be able to do to help mitigate at least some external factors, sadly I'm not confident in any of those methods working consistently. I think most external factors are just completely out of the control of designers, and all we can really do to combat the detractors we can't control is, naturally, to just try and design a game that encourages player motivation as much as possible. Luckily though, the second Misfit concept I wanted to discuss is something designers can actually design around. What about motivating players with rewards? Naturally, one way designers believe they can increase player motivation is to add rewards to their game in the form of anything that the player can attribute value to, whether it be points, in-game currency, cosmetics, achievements, collectibles, or even progress markers. Although, do these rewards actually increase player motivation on their own without other aspects of the game encouraging the player to want them? Honestly, I'm on the fence about this. On one hand, it can be argued that rewards give players a sense of accomplishment, which in of itself is motivating. On the other hand though, it can be argued that the sense of accomplishment solely comes from other aspects of the game that motivate players, like rewards being tied to narrative payoffs, good game feel, wish fulfillment, and satisfying challenges being completed. Personally, I lean towards the argument that rewards don't actually increase player motivation on their own. As an easily distracted creature like myself, I do be loving me some shiny objects, but even I need some form of motivation to collect them. Did I collect every wacky little object in the collectathon game Banjo-Kazooie simply because I felt accomplished when collecting those wacky little objects? No, I collected them all because I fell deeply in love with the world of the game and enjoyed the platforming, combat, and exploration needed to collect the objects, on top of enjoying the satisfying feeling of wrapping my freaky little claws around those wacky little objects. What I just described in a totally normal human way is that I don't think I would have been motivated by the rewards if it wasn't for some other form of motivation making me want to obtain them. Maybe I'm wrong and there is at least some small inherent form of motivation that I have to collect all rewards, but I'm inclined to believe that receiving a reward in a game that I have no other motivation to play doesn't really do anything to me. For example, if I just say right now that by watching this video, you just earned 100 points, I don't think that would really do anything to truly encourage you to keep watching my videos. If I use any other form of motivation attached to the reward though, even something like a satisfying animation that evokes good game feel, that can help motivate you to keep watching and want more points for the chance of seeing the animation again. Does tying good game feel to the presentation of a reward improve its effectiveness at motivating players though, or is that just another example of good game feel adding to motivation? I really can't decide. All I know is that I'd recommend against relying primarily on rewards to motivate players, even if they're used in tandem with other forms of motivation. If you want an example of an actual game that tried that method, take a look at the clicker game Cookie Clicker. That game has very minimal gameplay and is entirely based around rewarding the player with points and achievements to keep them playing. Thanks to it giving players a sense of good game feel along with every single reward, it managed to motivate a lot of people to play the game, but due to this being the only method of motivation, it quickly dropped off in popularity, and most players quickly found the game to be nothing more than a chore or grind to play. So yeah, I'm not taking a definitive stance on the question of whether or not rewards add to player motivation on their own, but even if they do, I wouldn't recommend relying on them. Lastly, for the final Misfit topic, I want to provide a potential answer to a question I asked myself throughout the production of this video. Could players achieving a flow state be what truly creates engaging difficulty and not player motivation? Well, first off, for those who are unfamiliar with flow states, I'll give a quick little history lesson. In 1975, the concept of flow was recognized by the psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi and was described as the state in which people are so involved in an activity that nothing else seems to matter. The experience itself is so enjoyable that people will do it even at great cost for the sheer sake of doing it. In 2008, Genova Chen, game designer and co-founder of that game company, wrote a thesis called Flow in Games that popularized applying the concept of flow to video game development and designing dynamic difficulty systems that help keep players in a flow state. If you've ever played the aptly named game Flow, he literally created that game to demonstrate his thesis. The game is designed around allowing players to choose when to increase and decrease the difficulty of the game by literally being able to advance or retreat through the levels of the game at will. In theory, this allows players to find the level of difficulty that's right for them at any given moment and achieve a blissful, immersive state of flow. Personally, I think the entire Flow in Games thesis is brilliant, and I can absolutely see an argument for flow being what truly creates engaging difficulty. That being said though, after admittedly a lot of flipping back and forth on this decision throughout the writing process of this video, I still believe that player motivation is the true answer. The way I ended up looking at it was that flow is a method that can be used to prolong player motivation, and that it doesn't really add or detract from the player's motivation. In fact, at least based on the understanding I've gleaned from reading Flow in Games, I think players will only get into flow states if their motivation to engage with the game isn't largely decreasing. After all, you can't reach a state of flow when playing games if you're not motivated to play the game itself. So, despite all my flip-flopping, I don't think that players achieving a flow state is what truly creates engaging difficulty. Now that we've covered all the concepts I wanted to discuss, that just about fully depletes my motivation to continue talking about player motivation. Hopefully we all still agree that my theory makes at least some amount of sense. At the very least, after everything I've said, I hope you now feel at least a little more confident when attempting to cultivate player motivation and avoid detracting from it. Regardless though, for my own sake, I'm just glad to have a theory on what creates engaging difficulty that sits right with me and doesn't make me feel like multiple types of player experiences need to be completely ignored in order for the theory to be sound. No matter how much I've thought about difficulty and this theory over the course of creating this video, I still can only think of one answer to my question that actually makes sense and takes into account all the different types of player experiences. I'm more confident than ever that what truly creates engaging difficulty is player motivation. Thanks for watching everyone, I've been Supersonic 7C, and hopefully I'll see you next time.